Right, now, as I was preparing this sermon for today, I was actually looking for, I've used this image before, but I couldn't find the cartoon strip. You all know about Peanuts. You know about Peanuts, Snoopy and Charlie Brown and Linus and his sister and so on. But I couldn't find the image to put in the pew leaflet. So guess what I'm not going to tell you about. Instead, as I walked into this morning and I had a look at my sermon notes, I had a little bit of an inspiration, I think. Because I was talking about cars training, and my car is a Jeep Cherokee. I suddenly had this thought that I should tell you a story that I've seen on the internet many, many times. And that is a Native American legend of two wolves, a Cherokee legend. Some of you may know it, and it's a bit cliche, but an old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. A fight is going on inside me, he said to the boy. It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil, he is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. He continued, the other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you, and inside every other person as well. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one you feed. There is a truth in the fact that in each one of us, we have this constant fight within us of our own personal desires versus what we can give of the fruits of the Spirit on the other side. And some of us never actually overcome the bad wolf, if you like. We always feed the bad wolf. We feed the weeds in our lives, if you like. And I think today's gospel, in the passage that we did, we find Jesus telling a parable that uses a kind of a similar image, good wheat and evil weeds, fighting it out in a farmer's field. It's also the same story in whatever newspaper any of us read this morning. Good and evil fighting it out in the world. In fact, it's the theme of all the great movies and all the great books we like. Harry Potter movies and such. The J.R.R. Tolkien movies and books. The Fellowship of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. All those stories are about the fight between what is good and what is evil. There is a force at every level of existence that works against what is good and what is God. There is a force that seeks to destroy the loving nature of creation. There is a force that exerts every effort to suck the life out of everything that promotes prosperity and health and hope and peace and joy. Throughout the ages, the faithful have personified this sinister force by many names. Satan, the devil, Beelzebub, Lucifer, or, as we heard in the passage today, the evil one. By whatever designation we choose, its intent, its nature, is to unmake what God has created and to deface, distort, and destroy whatever good it may latch onto, as it eats away at the beauty and the goodness of this world with the intensity of a parasite. Through today's parable, Jesus gives us an illustration of the power of evil, of the evil force that can invade every aspect of life. He makes this clear by painting a picture of weeds growing alongside wheat, imitating the good grain and intertwining its roots and growth with what was planted by the farmer, who, of course, in the explanation that Jesus gives, stands for the Son of Man, that is, Christ. And how did the weeds get into the field? Jesus says simply that the weeds came from an enemy, the devil, the evil one. An enemy of God is as good an answer as we will ever find for the source of that which works against God. In the service of baptism, in our tradition as Anglicans, we know this enemy as all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God, or, in terms of our catechism, the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy what God has created, or as the source of all that draws us from the love of God. We recognize at the very beginning of our Christian lives that we are constantly invaded by the weeds. And though we renounce the evil that the weeds represent, we also recognize something else in our baptismal promises. We see that our lives, like the field in the parable, grow with evil intertwined among the grace, love, and godly obedience that we promise to trust and employ in our Christian living. And we know from experience that no matter how intent we are to follow our promises, none of us will ever totally avoid the corrupting influences and tempting thoughts that lead us to go against the values of God. Maybe that's what makes so many of us anxious to do something, to do anything about perceived forms of evil in our close communities and, of course, in the wider world. In today's parable, Jesus has the slaves ask almost immediately whether they should destroy the weeds. And that sounds like a natural reaction, doesn't it? We must destroy the weeds, get rid of it. What farmer would not seek to destroy the weeds that suck vital nutrients from a well-planted crop? Wasn't that our first reaction when we experienced the terrible news of the shooting down of that Malaysian airline? Or isn't that what we think somewhere deep down when we hear reports of the war that continues to rage in what we call the Holy Land? When human beings think they know the source of and reality of evil, they almost always want to pinpoint it and do away with it as swiftly and as certainly as possible. Seeing with what we assume is a crystal clear view of what is good and what is evil, we move ahead, absolutely certain that we are right, that we are just in eradicating what seems obviously ungodly. But of course, history shows us that this is a misguided notion. It is folly. Any number of witch hunts reveal that they were more about making the hunter feel secure than actually doing something about the evil itself. In fact, if you go and look at the Middle Ages and Dark Ages and the execution of witches, a lot of innocent people were accused, convicted, and executed because of that. And it was just to protect the leadership and their carefully controlled, carefully established position of authority. Still, I think we have a strong urge, when threatened and fearful, to find something to cut out, to weed out, push down, crush, or otherwise stop and destroy. Shouldn't we admit that this kind of behavior often simply functions as an escape from a far more complex reality? In my mind, that's the argument that Jesus seems to be laying out in his response to the slaves who wanted to dig out the weeds. Wait, the farmer insists. Wait until the time of the harvest, because the process of ripping out the weeds will almost certainly destroy the wheat in the process. Doesn't this somehow ring true in the depths of our confessions? Don't we really know this truth? That the evil is strongest when it disguises itself as good and manages to incapacitate the creatures of God with the resulting confusion. It is a difficult truth to accept, I think, as we find Jesus telling us something we really don't want to hear, to leave the judging until later, to recognize that throwing what we perceive to be the weeds into the fire is God's job, not ours. When we encounter what we see as evil, what we believe is evil, we want to find the source of that and destroy it. We often are compelled by the false wisdom of, don't just stand there, do something. But as Jesus so often does, he tells us to rethink our human reactions. And he turns us in an opposite direction by having the onus say, in effect, don't just do something, stand there. Wait to let the nature of the godly prosper and prevail in due course. Profoundly, Jesus is leading us to cease chasing after the bad and concentrate on the good. You know, if you're constantly on a witch hunt, you know you'll eventually find the witches. The farmer could tolerate the actions of his adversary because he knew he would make it all right in the harvest, reaping the good and destroying the bad. Jesus is saying to us that we can relax in knowing that we don't have to be in the judging business or in the business of destroying that which would work against God. Because the owner of the farm, God himself, will make it right in the end. So we're left finally with a teaching that we would do best by paying less attention to the weeds, the evil in life, and simply stay away from it. In other words, like the Cherokee story, feed the good wolf. It is better for us to spend more time tending the wheat, the good in life, fostering its growth and putting it to use as Jesus would have us do, following the values of God's kingdom. Like the story of the wolf, the two wolves within, we certainly recognize in ourselves the complex workings of the world in which we live, the conflict that this Cherokee teacher was living and experienced, kind of as a dogfight in his gut. What it means to respond in this way to any evil, ranging from the horrors of political or even ecclesiastical life, to the selfishness of not caring for a neighbor in need, leaves us fighting against the very nature of our worldly humanity, fighting against nearly every instinct we feel and against nearly every example we learn from history. To even suggest such an approach is bound to lead to harsh and bitter disagreement, if not utter disbelief on the other side of the debate. It is exactly what we are experiencing in the church, more particularly in the worldwide Anglican Communion. In the conventional wisdom of the world, the teaching of this parable seems crazy and impossible. Yet we know that it is possible, from studying the leadership of those like Bose Nadir, Desmond Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, Harvey Milk, and Nelson Mandela, who chose not to tear at the weeds, but to nurture the wheat. They learned what they practiced from our Christ, and Jesus reminds us that those who choose to use the sword ultimately die by the sword. Indeed, at the decisive moment of his ministry, Jesus left the ultimate exclamation mark on the meaning of today's parable. Dying on the cross, he did not seek to destroy his enemies who sowed the lethal seeds that choked out his life. Rather, he forgave them. He looked to God to sort it all out in the world. He says, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And we, Christians, can, in the best moments of living out the promises of our baptisms, and as we faithfully look at the end of the Passion story, discover that the power of the resurrection proves the truth of the parable of the wheat and the weeds. In so doing, we will recommit ourselves to leaving the weeds to God. In so doing, we will, in ourselves and in the world around us, turn all our hearts and souls to nurturing the wheat that God has given us to nurture. Amen.